Hello, everyone. My name is Will Deathridge. I am the director of the New Realist Project. The goal of the project is to raise awareness of the work of a great philosopher named Xavier Zubiri. You can learn more about our work at thenewrealist.org. And the purpose of this video series is to provide introductions to a few of Zubiri's very important works, as organized by Marcos Mendoza. He is our curriculum coordinator for the New Realist Project. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to him, though I will say that for an additional resource, we recommend that you check out Clarifying Catholicism's series on Javier Zubiri's Sentient Intelligence, which we'll eventually cover, but it's another good resource to dip your toes into the waters of Javier Zubiri. Over to you, Marcus.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Marcos Mendoza, and I'm very uh, honored to be part of this project. Um, to give you a brief background about myself, I am a um, physicist, scientist by training. I have degrees in physics and engineering, but I've always had a thirst for philosophy, especially Catholic philosophy. And when I was coming of age, when I was in high school, I was doing a dive of many of the great doctors of the church, reading St. Augustine, all the way through reading, say St. Thomas Aquinas and the great scholastic traditions from then on. And during this time, I was trying to learn more about philosophers that are more towards my heritage, which is my Spanish heritage and Basque heritage. And I eventually gravitated to um, a man named Javier Zubiri, who we're going to be speaking about for the next few moments here. And he, in my opinion, is one of the uh, most insightful philosophers that has over the course of the 20th century. He was a Roman Catholic philosopher who sought to, I wouldn't say modernize, but I would definitely say to integrate the insights of science, especially modern physics, into a philosophical framework that's compatible not only with just the Catholic faith, but also with the Catholic understanding of philosophy as well. So, in my opinion, he has been able to raise the bar of what is a realist philosophy. Um, just to give you a little bit of background, today we're going to be discussing one of his earliest works, which is called Nature, History, and God, which was translated back in I believe, in the 80s. And it's a series of early essays that Zubiri wrote while he was in Madrid, Spain, when he began to
Marcus,
develop his.
what year are
Yes, go
we
ahead.
talking about? Right around yeah, what
Oh,
year? I
yeah.
know you said translation, but when was it written?
Right. So Nature, History, and God, the first edition was published in 1942, and it encompasses essays from um, the early 30s through the early 1940s. And this is whenever he was, during this time, Zubiri um, had a very unique experience to academia because he was very much a polymath, meaning that he learned and sought to master multiple fields of study, and so he actually managed to have classes and lectures with several of the philosophical greats, such as when we think of continental philosophy, it's going to be like Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. Then he also had uh, lectures and sometimes even conversations with the greatest physicists of the time, such as Werner Heisenberg, Albert Einstein, and Schrodinger. And so he was very conversant with the eve of these new modern physics, which is the development of relativity, the development of quantum physics. I believe he had more of an affinity towards quantum physics because it seemed to tie into his ideas of how nature is relational, not relative, but relational. Then he also went into studying about sociology, studying biology, and also he was actually very well versed in mathematics as well.
Yeah, I think I just want to stress really quick the importance of that. It's what drew me to Zubiri's work as well. I think a lot of people take for granted how metaphysics is built on a culture's understanding of how physics work. You know, you couldn't have Aristotle's metaphysics without his conception of how elements in the universe function. You know, you derive a lot of his ideas of act and potency from physics, for example. Same can be
Mhm.
said of the rationalist and empiricist traditions, which sought to derive philosophical systems from people like Isaac Newton, Galileo, etc. And you know, with the dawn of quantum physics, this idea that you know even qualities like color and sound are physical forces in the universe. We have a much more physical understanding of them. It's important to build a metaphysics and philosophical system that can account for the way we understand how the universe works today. And you know, for me, it eventually uh, is captured best by Zubiri's work, Sentient Intelligence, which will be towards the end, not to get too far ahead of ourselves
Right.
here, of these series. That's his magnum opus right there, which argues for a radical realist philosophy that unites body and soul, or mind and body, while a lot of Western philosophy has made too rigid of a distinction and too wide of a gap between intellective and physical functions. So, anyways, I'll let you continue on, but figured I'd just highlight the importance of his incorporation of modern chemistry, physics, biology, etc., into philosophy, because we kind of work backwards from the laws of physics into philosophy. You know. So,
Yes. No, I agree. And see, one thing that's really uh, drawn me more to Zubiri than some other philosophers, such as Alfred North Whitehead, who developed his process philosophy. And you know, it's funny. I have friends that are quantum theorists, quantum field theorists, that are drawn towards Alfred North Whitehead, and mostly it's due to the fact that you know his work's readily available in English, and Zubiri's most of his work is still untranslated in Spanish. But you know, like you already mentioned, sentient intelligence. His main metaphysical opus would be On Essence, and then, oh, excuse me, and then the essays that we're going to be going over in this brief talk is going to be about his early essays when he began to really flush out his ideas of of making a break between what you would call classical philosophy and even modern philosophy, and then trying to build something new and and you know, novel at the same time. So let me go ahead and just give you a brief background. So what's really fascinating about Zubiri, and so these essays, Nature, History, God, um, this is the beginning of his exploration from gathering the insights that he has made with multiple philosophers and scientists and other professors and lecturers of the time that were, you know, paragons of their field. And the idea could be, you know, the idea of personhood as a unique type of reality. And so what's really beautiful about Zubiri is that reality becomes this word of overflowing meaning, because in most philosophies, I mean, even rationalism, idealism, uh, empiricism, reality is kind of thought of as a zone of things, right? Like things are in space and time kind of thing. We have like this zone, this presence of things. But Zubiri radicalizes the word reality to represent something akin to like a nature or an essence. So like the idea that we are, as human beings, you know, we have our personhood. That's going to be a unique reality to us as human beings. You can also talk about the reality of how iron has its properties, right? You can talk about the reality of how you know, pancakes taste and that kind of thing. I mean, it all kind of like boils down to this idea of how things are existing of themselves. And it's really fascinating because in a lot of times when you read into a lot of, you know, from German idealism through existentialism, you usually have this dichotomy between something that's being in itself and something that's being for itself. And so like a lot of times in existential philosophy, you have Jean-Paul Sartre, or Jean-Paul Sartre, sorry, he would say in Being and Nothingness that man is this ever consuming being for itself. right? It can never be the being in itself kind of thing. But Zubiri kind of like skirts the entire dichotomy and speaks about realities as being of themselves. So it's a very subtle change in word, from being in, being for, but then when you talk about being of, it's a very radical shift. And a lot of times most people don't get that subtlety. And that's the thing about Zubiri. He's extremely subtle and he's extremely nuanced with his words and terminology, that once you see the shift, even just that changing to an of, it brings into a whole new light of insights.
He certainly writes like an engineer. He's more Aristotle than Plato. More systematic than poetic. No offense to Plato there.
No, but definitely, yes, I agree. He's especially, well, I mean, you saw when you read Sentient Intelligence how he goes through an entire excursion of
Oh yeah,
what a word really means.
yeah. No, he spends pages and pages just going through the etymology of words in Latin and Greek, and it's funny enough. I dove into Sentient Intelligence before anything else. I started with his most difficult, thorough work I possibly could have picked, but so it was a lot of hard work, but by far the most satisfying thing I've ever read in my life.
I'm glad to hear that. So I
Yeah,
guess just to talk more about nature, history, God, I would say that the idea here is that Zubiri wants to give us an overview of a kind of like a holistic philosophy that can encompass nature, the scientific laws, the realities of humankind, such as, what is history kind of thing. And of course, to him, the prime concern would be the nature of God, right? The role of religion in a human's life. And so being a devout Catholic, it's really fascinating with Zubiri that he doesn't proselytize the Catholic faith. To be honest, he really shows through philosophical principles, right, that you kind of necessitate the reality of God. Of course, a person is free to accept or deny the existence of God, but it's this kind of like the Spanish tradition of that God will always remain a problem. God will never stop to exist because God will at the least remain a problem for many people. So, and so I'm gonna go ahead and fast forward a little bit. So
can you just
when I
quickly
go ahead.
explore the God will always be a problem, because I think a
Mhm.
lot of listeners might not understand
Go ahead.
that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so the idea here is that in Spanish philosophy, most of the time when we're thinking of philosophy in an American context, it's usually going to be Anglophone. You're going to have it's going to mostly be based off of um, I guess an idea of, logic and these positivistic principles like logical positivism and that kind of thing. And what happens is that people are starting to look at like during this time, right? During Zubiri's time, like now I'm talking about the contemporary time, but during Zubiri's time, you had this shift in analytic philosophy where you have great minds like Bertrand Russell, um, you have Ludwig Wittgenstein beginning their explorations of logical positivism and the role of how do we understand the meaning of a sentence, the meaning of a statement. And of course, that kind of goes down its own rabbit hole kind of thing. But it's fascinating that in Spanish philosophy, such as with Miguel de Unamuno, Jose Ortega y Gasset, which was one of Zubiri's mentors. I think he was his advisor at some point as well. That you have this idea that God can't just be scurried away as kind of like this old superstition, because in the history of philosophy, God is always referenced as a kind of like, could we use God as a foundation stone, right? And so what is the fundament that all is grounded on? And so for the Catholic religion, especially when you read St. Thomas Aquinas, we have the Aristotelian proofs of the 5 ways to prove God's existence. And a lot of times people associate the idea of an unmoved mover as being kind of like that that foundation where everything is grounded upon. And that's how we can ground reality and all the things such as morality as well, that we can have an objective sense of what is right or wrong. And so it becomes an issue for a lot of people, because then you can just easily deny that situation. But in Spanish philosophy, you have this tradition of this ever inquisitive nature of, you know, what is God? Of course, as a Catholic, you have your dogmatic statements of what constitutes God through the divine simplicity, the Trinitarian nature of God, and the sort. But in a philosophical sense, um, the issue of God being by his nature, right, or by his, what we would claim his properties, right, as he's completely unknowable and the sort, you have to have that, still that kind of like that mystique of unknowability and uncertainty, and that leads to God never being encapsulated by a philosophy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think one thing I love to add here, and I think it is a problem that people like Zubiri have with the way previous philosophical systems approached a topic like God. When you reduce God to something like prime being, or like that grounding that you start from, you risk reducing God almost. Where what is God? Well, okay, God is the first mover. God is the prime being.
Mm.
And there's something almost arrogant, arguably, about that. Of course, Thomas Aquinas has his doctrine of analogy, but it becomes very easy to just kind of stop there. Like, okay, I grasp God. Grasp is just God is just the first mover, or he's the unmoved mover. When the opposite approach, that God is that ultimate unknowable mystery, that which exists beyond our horizon of knowledge, that draws us into the unknown, into greater contemplation about the universe. It's a very different approach, and in my opinion, it's one that's more respectful in the Christian tradition of God's unreachable, ungraspable nature. Of course, in the Christian tradition, we believe that God wants us to know him, which is why we can derive ideas about God through logic, because logic is how the human mind works. But I do think I agree that moving away from viewing God strictly as a grounding for everything else, in terms of things like logic, and instead seeing him as that which draws our quest for knowledge in an infinitely expanding horizon. I think that's more nuanced and respectful to what God really is, the great mystery, the great unknown, like that. So, as a person with a theological background, got my master's in theology, and I love that application, that idea that that's how God should be understood.
Right. And so these ideas, I would say that, to be honest, if you're interested in of a more theological treatment of Xavier Zubiri, there is a book called Man and God, and you're more than welcome to explore that. Of course, this is more of his developed thought, so a lot of the terms he uses and how he defines them are going to be a little bit different than what you would find in traditional philosophy. But you're more than welcome to explore that. But getting back to the nature, history, God. So there are 3 sections of this books, or these essays that he had. And so the beauty of nature, history, and God is that there's really 3 sections. Okay, the first one was the one that really got me into Zubiri when I was younger, because it had to deal with science and philosophy. And so in our discussion group that William and I are going to try to develop here, we're going to be exploring the first essays of reality, science, and philosophy, and especially the one called Our Intellectual Situation, which is very prophetic when you read about it, because it seems that philosophy, even since it's almost going to be 100 years since Zubiri wrote this. I mean, it's about 90 or so years since he first wrote this essay. he talks about how dismal sometimes our intellectual situation looks like, being a lot of things falling into the ways of materialism, hedonism, and also people confusing the role of science. Because a lot of people have raised science into its own philosophy, like a scientism, right? And to some people, even becomes an overriding ideology to the point of a religion. And so Zubiri tries to bring that back, and he really of course, a lot of these insights seem a bit rudimentary. They seem obvious when we mention them, that philosophy is best for the questions of why, and science is best for the questions of how. And that seems a bit obvious nowadays, but back then there's a lot of people trying to say that science, you know, could answer all the questions, right? And even with Richard Feynman, who later on said in a later interview, Richard Feynman being one of the greatest American physicists yeah, in the 20th century, he would say that the question of why um, can only be answered with a sufficient answer, right? He accepted the fact that it can lead to like infinite, possibilities of how to answer a question of why. But as humans, we have to accept the most sufficient answer, and that leads to a lot of different problems too. But the thing is, you would think that scientists would try to find definite answers rather than sufficient answers. So it's a little bit interesting thing when we go over there. So of course, he criticizes the idea that scientists, when they make discoveries, automatically declare them as facts. And a lot of times, what's really funny is that he's decrying a lot of the sensationalized publications that tend to happen nowadays, when especially when doctors supposedly find, oh, this is the new treatment to reverse aging, or this is a new treatment that will, you know, reverse Alzheimer's or cancer or something like that. And a lot of times, it's just a simple trial that a person did that is being overblown to be, the absolute reality kind of thing. And so he's talking about tempering these notions of, I guess you could say, intellectual pride and arrogance some people can develop when it comes to understanding the role of science in society.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, science is an excellent tool among so many others that we use to learn more about the world. And that's the brilliant thing about Zubiri, is him trying to unify all these different tools that our mind provides us with.
Mhm.
Because there is a great fracturing in academia. I'll ask a lot of engineers what they think about liberal arts majors, right? Or what they think, what a history major might think about, I don't know, someone studying art. Everything's very
Right.
compartmentalized. There's a lacking of a holistic nature of these different disciplines. And so you talked about the science bit of this essay. Could you speak a little bit about the history part?
Yes. Okay. So when you get to the second set of essays, Zuberi does his own take. It's not just necessarily a brief take, but it's his own take on the development of philosophy in its history. So the first essay that he has is called Historical Notes, where he goes over the idea of philosophy beginning from, he wants to go over the transition that happened during the excuse me, the modernist era. So in philosophy, it's funny that when we think of modernity, philosophy really starts being modern, quote unquote, at the time of Descartes. So this is already over 300 years ago. It's not associated with the modernist movement in literature that happened during the 20th century. So um, before he talks about Descartes, though, he mentions another scholastic theologian, Francisco Suarez. And what's really fascinating about Suarez is that he was considered to be the Jesuit equivalent of St. Thomas Aquinas, about 100 or 200 years after St. Thomas Aquinas' death. And he essentially had this book called Disputations. Well, it's not essentially the book, is really, it's a set of volumes and tomes where he would have his own kind of like questions, understanding ideas It's kind of like his own little summa. You can think of it. I wouldn't say little because it's book. The tomes are huge, but what's fascinating is that he was already exploring the consequences of the mind-body relationship if you separated them, which is what Descartes famously did. And of course, he was the first attempt to really construct a philosophical doctrine out of metaphysics. And what's really funny is that he he had a lot of detractors because he was going against St. Thomas. And what's really fascinating about Thomism and scholasticism is that really in scholasticism, a lot of people try to assume that Thomism is the only proper way. But you can also have the traditions of Duns Scotus, and you have also a lot of people don't speak highly of, but William Ockham can also be put in there as a nominalist and that kind of thing. But all these kinds of great thinkers, a lot of people started to detract and become reactionary. And so later on, these ideas began to just kind of like dim, right? And then later on, and you have Descartes. We don't know necessarily the influence that he had from Suarez, but we do know that a lot of his meditations that he developed for his rationalist philosophy, especially the "I think, therefore I am," came about from that possibility of being interactive with Suarez. But he goes into this really fascinating essay about. So in historical notes, the main emphasis is that if you look at these different philosophers, Descartes, Pascal, um, Hegel, and I believe he ends with Brentano, um, just the development of how the human person is situated in his intellectual life, right? So with Descartes' time, you have this notion of this mind-body dichotomy. You have this understanding that the senses could deceive, and so you have to basically you're left with reason to try to make sense of the world around you. And but then that starts falling apart because if the only way we can know about the world is through sense, then everything gets covered into a doubt. And so you try to develop this rational philosophy where you can depend on reason alone. The idea of Pascal, he was definitely a Christian philosopher who's always noted. Most people know him about Pascal's wager. Whenever it comes to the existence of God, it's better to believe in a God than to find and to find out there isn't one, than to not believe in one and then find out that there is at the moment of your death. That's the simplified version of Pascal's wager. But the idea is that for him, you have this idea where Pascal also had to battle. Not, I wouldn't say battle, but he had struggles with Jansenism. I have a feeling that I haven't read into a lot of Pascal myself, so I believe that he had some questions of whether or not Pascal had influence from Jansenism, but that was a heck of a heresy. Did you ever study Jansenism, William?
Yeah, but if you could briefly explain to the audience as brief as you can, that'll be great.
Okay. So Jansenism was this movement that arose during I guess the 1700s. And what was interesting is that it was an attempt to reconcile notions of free will and divine grace. And Jansenists believed in, I think they had this radical theories of predestination, and that God actively bestows grace on some while actively withholding it from others. And they also denied free will. And it actually leads to an idea that I think they also had extreme tendencies to overvalue the role of. They had extreme moral views
Yeah.
where you shouldn't, you couldn't be impure. Were they as bad as the Albigensians? I feel that they are sometimes.
I can't recall, but I know that a lot of my research of them comes into play with the church's doctrinal pronouncements, especially papal documents and the ecumenical councils that condemn a lot of their extreme ideas. I believe I'm not quoting verbatim, but according to these popes and councils, the Jansenists would attempt to deny that any goodness can be found from anything that wasn't explicitly, sacramental. For example, like they try to deny the goodness of any or the existence of any grace that couldn't be found in or that could be found outside of the sacraments. Very ultra rigid, ultra I suppose purist about how people can attain grace and salvation.
Yeah. So it becomes, yeah, it's so the Zubiri's reference of Pascal's, of course, more towards his philosophy, but he does reference the ideas of the possible influence of Jansenism because of the idea that Jansenists rejected free will, and it just made a lot of people, it became a question of like, are humans just machines kind of thing. And of course, there's been other thinkers that thought the same of whether a human is just an organic machine, such as Lemaitre. He was a Lemaitre, sorry, Lemaitre. He was a French, I think, a physician that wrote this work on Man the Machine, and he basically tried to establish that humans are just, perpetually self-winding organisms. So it's a very interesting idea. But anyway, I don't want to derail too much from there. We could probably have a whole field day on that when we covered later things. The next philosophy mentions definitely Hegel. And for a lot of people, when we talk about history in philosophy, you can't really not mention Hegel because his philosophy has been so influential in giving a kind of a philosophical foundation for an idea of like historical determinism, that philosophy over time is going to be this fruition of absolute knowledge, that there is a direction in history towards, fruition. And it's funny is that with Hegel, rather than having it just as a this passive experience with thinking, imagining nature being like imagining history or even time being like as the unrolling of a carpet where everything's set in stone. Hegel kind of dynamizes a little bit by making it dialectical, where you have these interactions between ideas. You could think of it as most people associate Hegel with the idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And what's really funny is that Zubiri himself will actually argue that such a notion is a crude simplification of the idea of perfection that occurs in history with Hegel. And if you want to go more deeply into that, the kind of like that trilogy of terms, it's really more associated with Fichte and Schelling, so who are also German idealists. But the idea is that with Hegel is that he tries to put humankind with this idea that we're on the forefront of this turning point of humanity, and eventually we're going to be subsumed into this great zeitgeist of what Hegel at the time thought would be the paramount idea of how humanity would flourish as it aspires towards absolute knowledge. For him being an idealist, Hegel definitely associated perfection with an idea of attaining absolute knowledge of things. And I've always made this joke whenever I mention other friends, to friends, that when you read Phenomenology of Spirit, and I concur with a lot of Zubiri's remarks, is that the idea when you reach to the last chapters over absolute knowledge, it kind of seems that he just wants to return back to the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, where we know that a chicken is a chicken and an egg is an egg, kind of thing. But
just take a few extra steps to get there, right?
Yeah.
Take the whole history of consciousness to get there,
right?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
to approach, and so and that's another thing too, that Zubiri is very careful with how he puts his bounds. The next essay he goes into is called Socrates and the Greek Idea of Wisdom. And then the last of that set of essays is called Hegel and the Metaphysical Problem. And so he goes into a lot of depth and detail, and a lot of times, most of these ideas are really lost to the, the everyday peruser of philosophy, right? Like, it's not like reading, the Ethics of Aristotle, or reading Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. This is, he's doing both a commentary and critique of past philosophies, and then he also is re-envisioning them along the lines of what he believes to be a more appropriate philosophy for the 20th century, which is his realism. When he talks about Socrates, it's a very fascinating discussion, because most of the time in more modern treatments of Socrates, they just really want to focus on his intellectual depth, his doubting, and of course, you can sometimes find the remarks of Nietzsche, who talks about Socrates as he who does not write. And Jacques Derrida wrote, hundreds of pages trying to unveil how the spoken word, when translated into the written page, you end up having this meaning in itself become transposed into the symbols of the page, kind of thing. And so with Derrida being his postmodern deconstruction itself, a lot of these ideas, it just shows that language is a tool in a sense, and then everything just kind of falls apart from there. But since these essays happened before Derrida and the postmodern movement, I'm not going to comment too much there, but Zubiri's critique and understanding of Socrates, I would say the kernel of his ideas towards the last portion of his essay, where he mentions that for Socrates, wisdom is ethics. Okay, and as you aspire towards wisdom and develop your philosophical sense, eventually you're going to find like a moral sense to everything, in a sense. You can't study ontology, you can't study epistemology or anything else without developing an ethical sense along the way, at least as humans, right? That in my opinion, maybe an AI could study metaphysics on its own, but eventually everything will eventually start to revolve around the moral question. So it's a very fascinating idea, and with Zubiri, he will develop this idea in later works, that whereas Nietzsche would emphasize that everything in humankind is this drive or will to power, for Zubiri, he believes the true nature of humankind, as exemplified by Socrates, is the will to truth. So I've always thought that was a very fascinating paradigm shift.
Awesome. Are there any other things that people should keep in mind before delving into these essays? As you mentioned, we have a study group, and you can actually, there's a link to fill out a form if you're interested in joining this study group on our website, which is thenewrealist.org. But any other, words of wisdom before we distribute this to the members of the group and, the broader public who's interested in Zubiri?
So I would just say, it's good to keep an open mind. Be willing to accept how words can be redefined or repurposed. Zubiri is not necessarily one for neologisms, but you do definitely need to take into the context that he uses certain words. He's not as bad as Heidegger, where Heidegger tried to hyphenate everything. But in my opinion, with Zubiri, it's good to know that he's giving an authentic and novel take on philosophical concepts that many of us have probably presumed to be in one light, and he's, for the majority of the time, he's providing a new light that's novel and creative at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting, because as much as I've loved studying him, it's total challenge talking with people from different philosophical traditions like Thomism, because Zubiri's definition of real or reality or truth or being is very different than that of a Thomist or a rationalist, empiricist, Heideggerian, etc. It's like learning a new language, you know? So I agree that keeping the open mind, and I mean, he's very careful at defining his terms. So if you're ever confused
Yes.
about what something means, he probably defines it somewhere before or somewhere later in the essay. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Very, very systematic, thoughtful guy who draws on the uh, legacies, even if they're mistakes of his predecessors. So he's not going in a completely different direction. He respects those who came before him. He stands on the shoulders of giants, and I think he does a phenomenal job of making something uh, very, very creative and original at the end of the day.
I agree 100%.
All right. Well, we thank you guys very much for joining us in this first episode of our series that will cover the works of Xavier Zubiri. As our study group continues to meet, we will continue to make more of these introductions to each of his works. Again, our website is thenewrealist.org. We encourage you to check it out for resources on Xavier Zubiri. Also want to give a special thanks to Dr. Thomas Fowler, who's given us a lot of support in our quest to raise awareness about Zubiri. He translated his sentient intelligence, Zubiri's sentient intelligence, into English, which is, I couldn't imagine even remotely undertaking a task like that. I mean, yeah. So thanks to him. And like we said, for even more resources, our the YouTube channel Clarifying Catholicism, which I also run, has a series on Zubiri's sentient intelligence. Thank you so much, Marcos, for joining today.